Though amphibians are adapted for life on land, reptiles really took adaptation for life on land seriously. They've got lots and lots of really awesome adaptations. So, reptiles, uh, first off, their skin is scaly. It has keratin. That's the same stuff that's in our fingernails. It's waterproof. It prevents evaporation much faster. But that does prevent it a little bit of a disadvantage because they need to shed it in order to grow. The reptiles have fully developed lungs, so they don't need to have a moist skin to aid in diffusion across their skin for breathing. Their limbs are by and large entirely underneath them. Obviously, there are some exceptions like snakes, but the reptile's limbs, instead of being out to the side, are up in front of them underneath their weight to hold a larger body. Reptiles have a lot of sense organs. So Jacobson's organ that we see in snakes is a way of sensing chemicals in the air. They have very acute hearing. Many of them can detect vibrations, can detect heat, all of which give them much more awareness of their environment in the land and on the air. And reptiles are heavily adapted to conserve water. We talked about their scales already. Additionally, they produce uric acid. And so uric acid is highly, highly concentrated like urea. And that allows them to conserve water as they excrete. Reptiles also have internal fertilization so that sperm and egg do not dry out. And most importantly, reptiles have amniotic eggs. An amniotic egg is almost like a cradle of nourishment and waterproofing. So amniotic egg, it contains the embryo. It contains usually a shell. In reptiles, it's kind of a leathery shell. In birds, of course, it's more of a calcium-based hard shell. And there's layers of membranes inside to help not only nourish them, provide them with oxygen, provide them with resources, allow them to stay moist and not dry out while on land. So that is like probably the most important thing of the vertebrate notes, so make sure you star that. Reptiles are ectotherms, which means that they do have to engage in those behaviors of sunning themselves and staying in the shade and whatnot in order to control their metabolism, control their thermoregulation. So here's the amniotic egg. I'm going to play just a quick video for you about it.
An amniotic egg provides nourishment to the embryo and functions as the embryo's total life support system. The reptile egg is encased in a tough, leathery shell. The amnion is a membrane filled with fluid that surrounds the developing embryo, cushioning it and preventing dehydration. The main food supply for the embryo is the yolk, which is enclosed in a sac that is attached to the embryo. The clear part of the egg is the albumin, a source of additional food and water for the developing embryo. The embryo's nitrogenous wastes are excreted into the allantois, a membranous sac that is associated with the embryo's gut. The chorion is a membrane that forms around the yolk, allantois, amnion, and embryo, and allows gas exchange for respiration. A reptile hatches by breaking its shell with the horny tooth, called an egg tooth, on its snout, which falls off shortly after hatching.
As you know, classification changes as we learn more about animals. There are four main groupings of reptiles that we'll discuss now. I would not spend a lot of time writing all of this down because I really don't see us asking you much about it. The first one is Sphenodonta, or the tuataras. They're native to New Zealand. They're only found there, or in other words, endemic. They have a really cool third eye that detects light. Doesn't focus like the other eyes, but it's useful in thermoregulation. The shelled reptiles are known as Testudinata, so the tortoises and the turtles. Tortoises are land-only. Turtles are water-based. Their shell, as you know, limits their mobility, but of course it is also a great protection. The shell is called the carpus, that's the top part. The plastron is the bottom part. It's actually fused into their skeleton. So you might have seen, like in cartoons, that a turtle can like pop out of its shell. You can't. It's any more than we can like pop out of our bones. It's actually part of their skeleton. Also, The shelled reptiles also have very long lifespans. Some of them live to be hundreds of years old. Squamata are the snakes and the lizards. Of course, they have many adaptations. Snakes, of course, losing their limbs. Their ancestors had them. There's evidence that they have limbs, tiny bones, hip bones, in pythons, for example. They, of course, have many, many adaptations, including hinged jaws. You might have seen snakes that can swallow large mammals whole. That's because of their hinged jaws. Toes with claws. Some of them have external ears. Some of them have movable eyelids. So lots of adaptations in the snakes and lizards. Finally, the crocodilians are a little bit like the cephalopods or the mollusks in that they're more complex than the other members of their group. So crocodilians have a 4-chambered heart. Most reptiles have 3-chambered. Crocodilians provide care for their young, whereas most reptiles lay the eggs and walk away. And so they're a little bit more advanced. Crocodilians are also in the same group that dinosaurs used to belong to. The last class we'll talk about in this video cast are birds, or the aves or the avians. What's most notable about birds, of course, is their adaptations for flight. Birds are noted by their wings in place of traditional limbs. Obviously, they also have feathers and beaks. Unlike reptiles and amphibians, birds are endotherms, so they have a higher metabolism. They're able to inhabit all of the areas of land, including the poles. We, of course, see penguins and other birds that can survive in those very, very cold conditions because of their metabolism. They also have other activities that help them survive in those cold conditions. Preening, which is arranging their feathers, allows them to increase their insulation that provides them in their feathers. Birds are, of course, also adapted for flight. They have many, many, many adaptations. Among them include hollow bones that aren't entirely hollow. They have support bridges across them that provide them with great strength, but being very, very lightweight. Their feathers, in addition to functioning in camouflage and insulation, provide them with a lot of aerodynamics. Their sternum is huge. You've probably seen like a turkey sternum at Thanksgiving. It's a really wide sternum. We call it keeled, and that's for their muscles attachment. So their flight feathers, which attach there, that are responsible for the flapping, need a lot of muscles there. That's why we eat chicken and turkey breasts and things, because there's a lot of muscle there, and that attaches to that keel. They also have a lot of fat stores, so the migrating birds, for example, use a lot of energy, so they have fat stores for that. And they also have a really cool way of breathing. It's kind of a one-way airflow where they actually have pockets in their lungs to make more efficient airflow, so they have to take the time to inhale and exhale separately. Here's what I was talking about, where they have the oxygenated air coming in and the deoxygenated air in the pockets so that it can flow out and have it. They inhale and exhale, but it's more efficient. Here's that keeled breastbone I was talking about for those flight feathers. In their bones, again, it's not entirely hollow. They have cross supports, which is why you should never give your dog a chicken bone to chew on, because they'll break very easily and puncture their mouth or their intestines. And they have a 4-chambered heart, like the crocodiles. That 4-chambered heart is more efficient. It keeps the oxygenated blood completely separate from the deoxygenated blood. As I mentioned, birds are related. Birds have a 4-chambered heart. So do crocodiles. There are many There's lots of bodies of evidence to suggest that birds share a common ancestor with modern-day crocodiles and ancient dinosaurs. So, like the crocodiles and the dinosaurs, birds have a 4-chambered heart. Birds' feathers are made of keratin, as reptiles' scales are made out of. Birds, like reptiles, make uric acid to conserve their water loss. And most importantly, birds have an amniotic egg. The amniotic egg has a hard shell, as I mentioned, and a bigger yolk, but nevertheless, both have that amniotic egg with internal fertilization and the yolk and all the membranes to support the developing offspring. Some other interesting characteristics about birds is that they have a crop, gizzard, and stomach. Those terms should be familiar to you, as we saw them with the annelids when we dissected them. Birds have a couple of other really cool adaptations. They have advanced care for their lungs, for their young. Of course, you know that most birds, incubate their eggs and protect their offspring. Many of them have monogamous relationships. That's also responsible for a lot of the differences we see in the male and female birds for competition for their mates. And so they have a much more advanced reproductive process than most of the other animals we've discussed so far. And as you know, many of them, although certainly not all, are migratory. Um, and that, of course, is movement in accordance with seasonal changes. There's been lots of really cool studies about the processes by which the birds learn their routes. And so if you ever have time, I really encourage you to take a look at some of those studies. They're just really, really interesting. Once again, we have the amniotic egg, and you'll notice there's a lot of similarities between this and that of the reptile. The amnion, the membranes that I showed you in the video, all of those are very, very similar, if not exactly the same. I'm just going to talk about some of the diversity of birds. I do not expect you to memorize these. I don't even care if you write them down, but just to show you there's a great diversity. There's 20, and there's lots of different groupings. So we have the passerines, which are the perching birds, the songbirds like the finches and the cardinals. We have the falconforms, the raptors. So those are the ones that have the curved bill and the talons for picking up large prey, the eagles, the hawks, and whatnot. We have the cytiforms, which are like the parrots and the parakeets that are the real colorful and noisy. They have incredible intelligence. They learn to talk, not just mimic. Some of them actually know their own vocabulary. We have the radites. Those are flightless. Those are like the ostriches and the emus. They have a soft palate, so their beak is a little different than the rest, and they lack that keeled breastbone because they don't fly. Of course, we have wading birds like the herons and the cranes and the flamingos. We have cavity nesters like toucans and woodpeckers. We've got shorebirds that have their very long legs that allow them to stand in the sand without sinking in, like the gulls and the seabirds and the sandpipers, excuse me. We have waterfowl, like the ducks and the geese with the webbed feet, the flat bill. What's really cool, the waterfowl, they have the ability, some of them, to restrict the flow of blood to their feet so that when they're floating in water, their feet don't freeze when it's water that's really, really cold. So just a tremendous degree of adaptations. This is it for this PowerPoint. We're going to pick up with mammals in our last one.